In our world of such political opposition, why does it feel like sociology is so much more left-wing than other disciplines? Why does every theory of social stratification just assume that it is always a bad thing? Well, I'm the Economancer, the high priest of the Economicon, and it is my pleasure to share with you the sacred text of the Economicon. Today we delve deeply in one of the last battles of sociology and the spillover effects of that into the Economicon. This topic spans multiple disciplines, and the debate, though mostly over, is still being brought out to the forefront in inter and intradisciplinary functions. And what do I mean by this? So today we're going to be talking about the Davis-Moore theory of stratification. Now, usually when I go over the classic text, I read some of it and break it down and give you my opinion on it. But today's a little bit different because this is really considered to be the last vestige, I guess you could say, of conservatism in the field of sociology. And it does have knock-on effects in economics because especially back in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, this is the time that you had Popper, Kuhn, Friedman, Stigler, all working in economics and philosophy of science. And then on the other side, in the field of sociology, you had this real strong bent from the structural functionalists that come from Parsons, who was a purveyor of Weberian beliefs. And they intermingle because the methodological basis between, say, the Chicago school from Stigler and Milton Friedman laid heavily into similarities for Parsons and even these authors, that would be Davis and Moore. So essentially, what is this hypothesis? Well, to take like a 30,000 foot view of it, essentially it states that society is stratified, and the stratification of society is there for a reason. Now, what could this reason possibly be? The statement is that we have incentives and we have structures in our society that give people where they need to go. And so the basic statement is that the reason we have stratification and the reason why stratification is such an issue in our lives is because a lot of people don't like being where they are, despite the fact that they're stratified in that certain area, is because that's where they are most profitable for being. Now, again, that sounds crazy, right? That we have stratification in society is because it functions for society to have stratification. To some people, this may sound crazy. To others, this may sound like, well, duh. I mean, the reason we have CEOs versus the lowly workers is obviously because there's differences in human capital. There's differences in dispositions when it comes to like personality. There's differences when it comes to other factors that cannot be controlled by the government, such as like family life and stuff like that. So obviously we would expect the stratification to be there, and that we could understand that the stratification does necessarily lead to the outcomes that we get, which, if your assumption is that they're good, therefore it's concluded that because the stratification has a purpose and because it does something and the end result is good, therefore it's good. So why is this such a big issue? Well, first of all, the structural functionalists coming from Parsons, coming from Weber, they have a very conservative bent in this. And there's actually a great article on this. This is The Life Course of a Socially Constructed Classic by Robert C. Hauhart. I don't know if I said that right, but I hope I did. And essentially he goes into Kingsley Davis and Wilbur D. Moore. They both were student of Parsons. So who is Talcott Parsons? Essentially, he's an American sociologist from the classical tradition. He wanted to create this social action theory, and which essentially was an amalgamation of economics as well as other disciplines such as psychology that kind of all coalesced together into a formal structure for how society exists. And so that was kind of his goal, was to set up this grand general theory for sociology, and basically to bring in the processes from other disciplines. His best friend was Joseph Schumpeter, who we've talked about in entrepreneurship, who I will end up doing another video on because he actually had some interesting ideas, which correlated heavily with Parsons, which you can actually, delineate Parsons and Kingsley Davis and more. So let's get on to the next part. Why is this matter? Well, first and foremost, this theory is in the classical text, and it's the only theory in the classical text that has a remotely right-leaning bent. So why is it in the text? Well, it's in the text because the way they've said it is two reasons. One is that it spawned such a great amount of debate in that it moved sociology forward against this backwards idealism. And the second is that they like to look at the failures of these other theories to show how theory has moved forward since then. Now, the third, and I guess you could say the more optimistic position, is that there's actually a lot of people that, even though they may go, oh, this is terrible, this is evil, blah, 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 there's all of these issues associated with it, they go, you know what? It does explain a lot. It doesn't explain everything, but it does explain a lot about the structure and the function of society itself, especially when it comes to how this interacts in our day-to-day life. And it may not be perfect, but it does do a lot of explaining, and it's really predictive as well. Now, so let's get into some of what they say. So we have this right-wing narrative, and then we have this debate that's getting ready to happen. And this debate, for what people don't know, this is really the last debate in sociology, I guess you could really say in most of the social sciences, against what this author that I said, Hauhart, has said is the Marxist influence in American sociology. So it's rather important that we think of this as a system of knowing what's going on in society. So if we have this Marxist conflict critical school that is growing in relation to the structural functionalists, the last debate is going to be the most important debate. So essentially, we could say that this came out in the 1950s into the 1960s. It's built upon later, but there wasn't really much of an attack until the 1950s, right? And that was first laid down by Tuman. And basically he says, it makes sense, but there's a lot of things that can be done better with it. So we need to build upon it. Well, then there becomes an acceleration of the commentary on this. And, we go back to how it's going to be criticized for the next 30 years. And essentially, they try to test this empirically. They find some results that are in favor, some results that are against it, but there's no consensus. But essentially, by the 1980s, we just saw it just collapse in general because it was found to be inadequate without reference to, other theories of the time in the 1980s that provided a much more particularized look at society, right? So this is something that was brought up, that it doesn't reflect the level of technology in society, the available terms of discourse, and modes of linguistic repression, structural pressures from coordination, the existing level of solidarity, the relationship between differential authorities and others. And that came from Milner. So he was saying, if you brought all this in on top of it, we could understand that a little bit better, and we would have some type of synthesis. Now, the problem with this is when we move into the terms of discourse and modes of linguistic suppression, we're automatically moving from what they're trying to position themselves as structural functionalists, which one of these days we might need to go into structuralism versus post-structuralism. and, semiotics and moving into syntax, into structure of societies and stuff like that. But essentially moving from discourse and mode of linguistic repression, we're moving into post-structuralism, because we're saying that the structure of the society, as we were talking about in the de Beauvoir situation, about the male structure of society, comes from the syntax because it's always been male. This linguistic repression means that the Davis-Moore hypothesis is trying to reflect poorly on non-Western countries by saying, hey, they didn't follow this, therefore bad, or that their society or something like that is necessarily structured only in that. And that, we're talking about the structural pressures for coordination. So why would society need to coordinate? That means the structure of society is pushing people to coordinate towards a certain end, and that, this relationship between the differential authority. And again, this is bringing in postmodern or post-structuralist arguments into it. So what can we derive from this principle of stratification, and why this influenced something so greatly without delving too deep? And one of the main things to take away is that, as we'll get into in the argument for the presuppositions and the methodologies and the philosophy of science behind econometrics, this plays heavily into why and what the structural functionalists were trying to do. They were trying to set up a system that wasn't saying, okay, we know what's going on with every person. What they're trying to say is, okay, we're not psychology, so we actually have to look at not particularized issues. We have to look at general trends, what constrains those trends, how institutions interact with those trends, and what the overall structure of society is doing or is saying. And so this is a strong argument to be made that Milton Friedman makes in his 1953 paper. This comes from Weber's ideal being kind of argument that he has about why we use proxies. And that we can't really use proxies, and all of this just gets wild. It's an extremely deep discussion to have, but ultimately, this theory was basically beat down in the literature. It wasn't beat down empirically. It wasn't beat down because the presuppositions of it were incorrect. It was beat down because it was literally considered conservative, and therefore it could not maintain itself within the academic structure. Now, this goes into stuff that Jonathan Haidt's talked about how, 50 years ago, you could actually see, a 80-20 or a 70-30 bent for more liberal to progressives versus, conservative or conservatarian, however you want to define it. And as academia has continued to grow, it has also continued to grow this difference between conservatives and progressives. And that ultimately, probably one of the major failings of this is that it wasn't attractive enough as a theoretical proposition to bring in conservatives. And this is kind of a disposition idea on conservatism. They're not very likely to go into academia. They're not very likely to talk about these willy-nilly theoretical models. They're more likely to get like a business degree or something like that, something that's applicable, and they're just going to go out there and they're going to go do something, and they're going to manage and do that stuff. They're not really, and again, this is all kind of general. It doesn't mean always that they're not really super creative, or that they're going to build on all kinds of this stuff. So that's kind of the major failing, is that it didn't attract enough conservative attention. And the second part is that some of the major conservative camps at the time, I guess, and they're not conservative, they're libertarian, the Chicago School and the Virginia School of Economics. The Virginia School of Economics actually did integrate a little bit of this into theirs, but they also integrated some of the Austrian ideas into it. So Virginia, through Buchanan, is an offshoot of the Chicago School that leads to this more public economics. And this is kind of moved into the realm of like what the structural functionalists were trying to do from the sociology perspective. And then this goes into, Talcott and Schumpeter and their works in, the sociology of economics, or economic sociology, depending on who you ask and how they feel about it. But ultimately, this theory, this hypothesis, despite what most people think, is actually extremely accurate. One of the biggest criticisms, outside of it just being conservative, is that it doesn't take into account large movements, right? Because it lacks that conflict theory, because it's against conflict theory, essentially. It lacks the dynamism that comes from, okay, we have certain level of oppression until society snaps, or that it doesn't address the reasons why we have negative social stratification. Even if it does say, hey, these are the positives of social stratification, it doesn't address the negatives of social stratification, such as things like slavery. It would just assume that these things are just a part of the structure of society. Now, the problem with a lot of those strange criticisms is that they apparently they have never read Parsons. They had never read Schumpeter. They had never read Moore and from Kingsley Davis. So they just assumed that that's what they were saying, but that's not actually what was going on. What they said, and this is something that you can take from Parsons, he was like, okay, so we have some level of evolution that happens within society. We can look at why that evolution happens, and we can, post hoc rationalize what's going on. Or we can say, from a structuralist perspective, obviously there was some level of evolution, some point of knowledge, some paradigm shift in how we're thinking. That's the Kuhnian and the Stigler reference, that we come to some point in society that it cracks. And why that happens, that's something we can look at. We can say it came from economics. We can say because, we have this idea that certain levels of revolutions happen because a government becomes such a certain size. Once it comes to a certain size, boom, it gets punched through. We can point to the level of private control rather than governmental control into this level that society breaks. But what he's saying is institutions, society, culture, all of these things are an evolutionary process. And evolutionary processes do take vast amounts of time. But that doesn't mean that you can't look in an evolutionary process and find very specific points in those processes where it jumps. And there's no reason why you couldn't apply that to, the evolution of institutions and societies and social action and those theories. So even if the social stratification does have the net benefit, if that net negative continues to rise, there is some tipping point where it's going to spill over into the larger realm of society's consciousness, and it's just going to have to come through, and it's going to have to stop. And if we look at modern representations of things, we also know now that a lot of the aversion that we have to, say, inequality and stuff like that, so deriving stuff from Jonathan Haidt's work on morality, we do know that when we have this like fairness dynamic, we do know that both the right and the left fundamentally want a fair world. What that fairness means between these two is significantly different. But that doesn't mean that there's not a sociobiological reasoning behind that. And so it's very likely that some level of education may be involved in this evolution on how we see the good and bad outcomes that come from inequality. And that's another thing that, this hypothesis is really trying to get towards. But it never had additional thinkers to motivate this to higher levels, because by the time it came to a point in sociology or economics that is feasible to really interact with this, it had already moved out of the stage of caring about structural functionalism and moving into post-structuralism and determining why and how structures affect society in negative ways more so than looking at what is going on in good ways. And this is kind of that optimism versus pessimism, debate. Glass half full, glass half empty kind of thing. But ultimately, we also have to understand that there's a heavy emphasis from Marcuse, Horkheimer from the Frankfurt School was heavily involved with this debate against Parsons' social theory of action and this Davis-Moore hypothesis, and that they seen it as the new bourgeoisie, or whatever you want to call it, the new intellectual underpinning of capitalism. They had rallied some of these criticisms against, Stigler, Milton Friedman, and stuff like that, saying, that these individuals, they're just trying to maintain the status quo, and that because the status quo is necessarily evil and necessarily bad, that, to deal in their ideas is not useful. This is something that Marcuse talked about in his I can't even remember the name of the paper. It's about oppression, about getting into like pre-censorship and censorship, as well as censoring those with different opinions on the outset. It's funny because the Frankfurt School considered Parsons a Nazi. Some people considered him a communist, and in fact, he disliked both. He was a purveyor of American exceptionalism, as was both Davis and Moore. They actually were fundamentally involved in what society was trying to present through American exceptionalism, and noting that the incentives that drive people to be unequal were also the things that drove society to accomplish great things. Because we can't assume that, society moves forward strictly by the notion of the collective, that we have to understand that society does get punched forward by an individual or two. This paradigm shift happens. Again, to use that Kuhnian language. And so with that, I'm going to be doing more into this. And the reason why I want to do this, because I actually don't think that this is the bulk of the argument that needs to be opened up in this. But this is going to be something that's going to be opened up much broader. We're going to go into Parsons. How was he influenced? What was he influencing? I will eventually, in the methodology and econometrics, go into Stigler, Weber, and Friedman. But also to note that all of this is intertwined. This was the last vestige, I guess you could say, of right-wing academics in social sciences, and how all of these ideas over time have become deconstructed and most notably taken out of context, but also dismissed very crudely because people purposefully misinterpreted what they were saying, just so they could consider them evil, and just so they could be dismissed on those grounds. When in all actuality, there's a lot that we can gain from understanding this, even if you disagree with them, even if you think Milton Friedman was something, or, I've read that Hayek was a Nazi, despite the fact that he ran away from the Nazis. He spoke out against them on a consistent basis, wrote The Road to Serfdom, attacking Nazism and communism and socialism and any type of planning and action, spoke out against, fascism. But all of these individuals, we see them just getting attacked and derailed in modern society, and a lot of their arguments are being lost to the wayside. It just so happens that the Davis-Moore hypothesis is still in our current lexicon, despite the fact that no one gives any attention to it outside of it's in every single undergrad book in sociology. So maybe there might be some ideas there to spawn further research that we can all utilize and maybe get a better understanding of society, and moving to some type of, general theorem for sociology, some general theorem for economics, rather than staying in this immature stage of looking at just like individual sections and trying to derive conclusions strictly in those places, and not having some broad theoretical framework that can be applied in all areas. but I don't know if that's even a possibility due to, the craziness of people. I know this rant was really out there. You may not care to listen to all of it, but I do hope you come away with some type of knowledge about this hypothesis and some type of idea what was going on during this time. There will be a more thorough review going into each of this, and I hope you have a wonderful day.